Hello guys, Film Recaps here, and today we're covering a 2021 horror movie called Red Snow. The movie flips off with a lady looking for her pet named Rhodey on a cold night. She steps out of her house in the woods and walks into the forest. As she treads through the forest, some figures speed past her. A little while later, they materialize to be human-like creatures. They attack and make their way with her. In the next scene, Olivia Ramello is in her home as she goes about her daily activity. On her couch, she types about a vampire story on her computer and makes some tea. Later that afternoon, a letter arrives in her mailbox and she goes to check it out. She reads it to find out her manuscript has been accepted by her publisher and gets back to her house. That night, Olivia pours herself some wine and something eerie happens near her window. A bat hits the glass and gets knocked out in the process. She gets back in and takes something to help it. She walks outside, gets the bat, and brings it back inside for treatment. After administering treatment to the bat, she picks it up and puts it in a room. Later in the night, a man drives by and stops in front of her house. He stops and stares while the bat struggles to free itself out of the box she put it in. Eventually, he drives away. The next morning, Olivia talks with her relative on the phone when something out of the ordinary happens. Something moves in her house. She gets upstairs, arms herself, and finds out that the bat she saved from earlier was a vampire. Now in his transformed state, Olivia sees the unclad man and runs back to her living room. Then, Julius King, a private investigator from the Severin group, knocks on her door and asks to see her. While inside, Julius tells Olivia that he was looking for 3 suspects. He then shows her photos of 3 men. One of the men in the photos looks exactly like the transformed man she saw in her room. Olivia denies ever knowing them nonetheless. Just then, something moves in the other room and Julius gets suspicious of Olivia. He then asks her if she likes vampires. Olivia acts confused and Julius messes with her head. After joking around a bit, Julius leaves Olivia and walks out of her house. While outside, he notices the patch of blood in the snow and asks Olivia about it. Olivia tells him about the bat she saw the night before and Julius warns her about bats flying in the winter. He says they only fly around summer and walk away. Julius gets back to his car and makes a call to his agency, explaining his findings at Olivia's house. Back in her home, Olivia brings out some sticks and fabricates the cross from them. She then picks a drum and enters the room where the vampire was. As she opens the door, she sees Luke, the bat from the night before. He's now a transformed vampire human. Olivia nervously introduces herself and gives Luke some new clothes. Meanwhile, Luke just keeps asking for blood as he collects the clothes and walks back into the room. Olivia closes the door and rushes to the store to get some steak and pig's blood. She rushes back to her house and microwaves some of the blood. She gives a portion of the liquid to Luke, who reluctantly drinks it and asks for more. Olivia gives him more until he passes out on the floor. That night, Olivia knocks on the door and sees Luke already up and running like a charm. She sits down with him and talks about her profession with him. Apparently, Olivia is a novelist whose interest is writing about vampires. Luke sits there and smiles as Olivia babbles about her interest in vampires. As the duo discusses, Luke senses 2 humanoid figures making their way to Olivia's house. He tells Olivia of his senses and asks her to check outside her house for intruders. Olivia is skeptical at first, but he orders her to go and check out her home. She walks outside and sees no one. Unknown to her, someone was on the other side of her door staring at her. Olivia gets back to Luke and tells him why she kept him there. Luke frowns at her reason and she shows him the way out. He immediately begs her to let him stay and she agrees. He then tells Olivia that all there is to know about supernaturals in the Severin group who hunts them. She retires for the night. Before she goes to bed, she puts a rosary on her doorbell. That night, she dreams about Luke coming to her bed to drain her blood and jolts back up. In the morning, she gets out of bed and prepares Luke's breakfast. As she takes out the trash, Julius's Jeep is seen in the background. Luke takes his breakfast and chats a bit with her. Meanwhile, Julius checks out Olivia's trash and finds out that she's been making use of blood these past few days. Olivia, on the other hand, gets to her kitchen to make herself some breakfast as Julius gets in and holds her hostage. He gets to the room where Luke was kept and points the crucifix at his face. This affects Luke as he screams from the pain. Meanwhile, Olivia manages to knock out Julius. She walks outside only to come back in to see Luke feeding on Julius. She screams and runs outside again. Luke finishes his meal and calls out to Olivia. Later that night, Luke tries to call Olivia. He compliments her about the manuscript and makes a deal with her so she could open up the door for him. She opens the door and sees Luke standing beside Julius's body. She shrieks and invites him to the living room. Luke gets to her living room and they discuss making her script better. After their discussion, she gets back to her room and continues her writing. Meanwhile, Luke is in the garage as usual when he senses something strange. He's right as something walks towards the garage door. He comes near to the garage and tells his fellow vampire that he's not ready yet. He says he needs more time and the other vampire walks away. The next morning, Olivia is seen in her car. She gets her tab and opens her pigeonhole. There, she sees Julius's business car. She gets to his trunk and checks out his stuff. That night, she gifts Luke some clothes and invites him back to the living room. Luke gets dressed and goes to the living room. There, he and Olivia share a toast while someone watches them through her window. Later on, she falls asleep and Luke watches the blood coursing through her veins as she sleeps. He gets hungry and tries desperately to control himself. Shortly after, she wakes up and Luke looks away because his eyes and teeth were already changed into that of a hungry vampire. Gets upstairs and changes into her nightie, leaving Luke in the living room struggling to control his urges to get Olivia's blood. A little while later, he gets back to his normal self. He walks outside the house and meets up with his other two friends, Jackie and Rock. They tease him over his attire and talk about Olivia and her body. Luke tries to save Olivia by telling Jackie and Rock that he's taken out Julius. When they ask to show where Julius's body was, Luke opens the door for both of his friends. However, as the two enter the house, Jackie runs upstairs to attack Olivia while Rock holds down Luke. Jackie catches up to Olivia and holds her hostage and tells her to run as fast she could so she could pursue her. Jackie also hijacks Olivia's house from her. Olivia gets to her car and picks up a crucifix and some clothes to protect her from the cold. Meanwhile, Jackie catches 3 stray guys probably coming back home from a bar or something. They each hold cans of beer in their hands as Jackie invites them to follow her. Being the cute girl that she was, the men follow her. Meanwhile, Olivia is in Julius's car, gets his tab, and types in his passcode. The tab unlocks and she finds out more about Luke and his band of merry vampires. She leads the 3 men to Luke and Rock and they feast on them. She then dials a number she found on the Severson Group business card and a man named Simon picks up the call. Olivia begs Simon to get some men to finish off these vampires. At that moment, Luke and Jackie make out passionately while Rock plays with one of their victims' parts, just like Julius King predicts. Olivia finds out on the phone that all she's been told by Luke was a lie. She finds out Luke and the others aren't even the last vampires in the world and also that candy elves don't even exist in the first place. Afterward, Olivia comes upon the realization that if she wants to get rid of her bat problem, she's gotta have to do it herself. The next morning, she packs out steaks, bottles of holy water, a good sweater, and a crossbow from Julius's car and proceeds to take her house back from her everlasting assailants. She gets to her house to meet them sleeping and walks silently into her living room, watching her every step and making sure she doesn't wake them up. She wraps up Rock in a sheet and drags him outside the house while he's still asleep. While outside, Rock comes to and regains consciousness. This angers him as the sun was biting its way through his skin. Eventually, he opens his eyes. Seeing this, Olivia shoots an arrow into his torso. Rock smiles and tells her that she missed his heart. Olivia drops her crossbow and runs into the woods. Meanwhile, Jackie notices something strange and wakes up. Back in the woods, Rock catches up to Olivia and tries to feed on her. Olivia, on the other hand, has a different idea. She removes the crossbow and aims it at Rock. This time, it takes him out. Then she gets back to the house and faces their leader, Jackie, who bites her legs and checks out Olivia's bag. She takes out Olivia's holy water and a steak. She's about to take out Olivia when Luke shows up and tells her to stop with the crossbow in his hands. Jackie stops and moves closer to Luke with the holy water hidden away from Luke's sight. Luke threatens her still, but she doesn't budge. All of a sudden, Jackie throws some holy water on Luke and this affects him. She laughs at him as he writhes in pain and walks back to Olivia's. As she's about to take out Olivia, Olivia takes her out instead. A while later, Luke comes to and sees Olivia pointing a crossbow at his head. After a bit of whining from Olivia's end, she finds out Luke really cared about her. Unfortunately for Luke, Olivia finds out about his feeding spree from the night before. She sees another person's sweater on the couch and shoots Luke in the heart. 10 months later, Olivia's book, Season's Bleedings, becomes a bestseller and she signs autographs at the bookstore. Simon comes by and she signs his copy. Then Olivia gets home and prepares a cup of tea and a cup of blood. She gets to the basement and there's a tied-up Luke who's been starved for blood for a long time. The movie ends as Olivia pours the blood on Luke's head and watches him suck every last bit of it, smiling. Thanks for watching, guys.